Hello, welcome to the Classical Top 5 with me, Tommy Pearson, and with Richard Bratby and Charlotte Gardner. We've been away for a few weeks, a mixture of holiday, illness, and good old-fashioned unavailability. We're back, but this is our very final episode. As I mentioned in the last edition, it's sad that the podcast is coming to an end, but it is for a rather pleasant reason. We're all busy again. When we started the podcast last year, the country and much of the world was in lockdown, and for those of us in the arts, like so many others, our lives and livelihoods suddenly stopped. Creating and producing the podcast was a tremendous lifeline for us all, I think. A place to exercise our brains a bit and spend time talking about the thing we love, music. It's been a fantastic thing to do, but now it's time to get back to the day jobs. So we thought we'd spend this final edition looking back on some of our favourite guests, some of their favourite music and discoveries from the 54 podcasts that we've recorded in this time. We've had some incredible guests on the show. I think everyone would agree with that. Opera directors like Peter Sellers and David Pountney, conductors, Daniel Harding, Mark Elder, Barry Wordsworth, Michael Seal, star performers like Stephen Isserlis, Julian Lloyd-Webber, Tasmin Little, Nick Daniels, Stephen Huff, Thomas Allen, administrators like Stephen Maddock, Nick Kenyon, Gillian Moore, John Summers, writers, broadcasters and actors like Simon Callow, Reverend Richard Coles, Stephen Johnson. So many wonderful contributors. Richard, you've been with us from the very beginning. Any that really shine out for you in the time that we've spent here?
Oh, I don't know. It's fascinating, isn't it? Everyone has such a, it's salutary seeing how people with such different perspectives and such different careers, different ways of life, all find something quite personal in music. All have something, this capacity to surprise you. And, it's the most important lesson I think you ever learn really with music is just that one that the piece of music that's never interested you, that's bored you, that you've dismissively written off is actually the piece that goes right. Someone else's heart speaks very, very deeply to them. And it's always important to remember that and not to start getting too dismissive and to be open to these things. Who have we had? Early on, it's thrilled to talk to Philip Henshaw. Charlotte and I both professional writers, and to sort of be, it's a real sort of we're not worthy moment. I think Fiona was with us at that point. To be with a writer of that caliber, I was genuinely quite scared. I was genuinely quite nervous about talking to him because he is one of the most formidable sort of prose craftsmen of our time, certainly in the fields of journalism and literature. A man with a galaxy-sized brain when it comes to literature, generally novels, fiction, any kind of writing. There seems to be nothing he doesn't know. And I was kind of a bit intimidated. So I was quite chuffed when I discovered we were on the same wavelength, that he loves Berlioz's memoirs as much as I do. And again, he's such a, the sort of love, the enthusiasm that comes through, that came through from that. Very early on, wasn't it? That's one of our podcasts.
One of his best friends is Thomas Addis. And he also, of course, wrote the words to one of his operas, at least. And he's just such, as you say, he's knowledgeable about pretty much everything, but particularly books, but also music. Such a deep knowledge of music, and I think it permeates through everything he does, really.
I don't think we got the opportunity when he was on to actually talking about his own double bass playing career. I know he used to play double bass in youth orchestras in Gloucestershire, I think it was, when he was a lad. And he wrote an incredible article many years ago for The Independent, which I'm always trying to find again, because I want to quote it. And the phrase I remember was he said that, you'll message to kids, don't take up the double bass, you'll never pull playing a double bass. And no matter how hard you try, he says you spend 6 months trying to master the prelude of a Bach cello suite on your double bass, putting all your heart and soul into it, and it still ends up sounding like a shed being dragged across a concrete floor. And anyway, it's just great to talk to him in person. I don't know. I've just got to. Obviously, I'm going to get in and claim this one. I think we all remember the night we talked to Mark Shaman, didn't we? Yeah. Live from New York, about Broadway, about his career on Broadway. What a legend at the piano as well. I think we're all. that was a special night for all of us. Doing podcasts having in the evening rather than our usual sort of brisk morning start. Made it feel a bit special to begin with, but wow! We could have gone on.
Certainly could have done. He's an extraordinary character. He's just, by the way, this very last evening, this morning, been announced as he's got an Emmy nomination for a song he wrote for a YouTube video, which is of course quite unusual in itself now. But he's just, I think it proves that he's still got it. Hairspray was just opened again in the West End. He's been in London for that. And then it sort of promptly closed again because somebody in the crew, I think it was, tested positive for COVID, and there's all that went on. But that's really one of the great sort of modern classics of musical theatre, isn't it? Hairspray, a huge hit all around the world.
But it's that thing, again, isn't it? I mean, remember how he's on. We would just mention a lyric or a word or even the title of a song, and instantly he'd be on the piano. Just just a guy just exudes music, lives music. That's the element he swims in, and it's so easy in our world to start sort of putting down barriers, saying such and such a person does that. This music is important. This is serious. This is not so much. And it's important to remember that musicality, pure musicianship, it exists in all sorts of forms, and when you encounter it, it's always absolutely.
Well, I think that's been one of the most pleasurable things about this podcast, Charlotte, is that we've really been able to talk about any kind of music we want. I mean, I'm sure we haven't really touched on a lot of music, to be fair, but something like that where we were talking to Mark Shaman, it's a great sort of release almost from the other bit of repertoire that we spend quite a lot of time talking about.
Oh, completely. I had an absolute blast preparing that one because it's the music that I grew up with, particularly as a teenager, obviously not Hairspray, but going back to that music, all the Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals. I mean, it was absolutely wonderful stuff. And he was just joyous. I'll never forget the moment. We had no idea. So everybody listening, we just had Mark's face on the screen. We had no idea there was a piano underneath him. And then suddenly he started playing. I think it was a massive shock for all of us. It was just absolutely glorious. And yes, just the other thing that I think the conviviality has really shone through. I mean, there are so many people, maybe not even the sort of huge international names, but there are some people who we have just had such wonderful, illuminating conversations with. I loved talking about, one of my favourite discussions was talking about Ives with Christopher Russell, when we all discovered that we really loved Ives. And Ives was a very new discovery for me, really. I'd never taken an awful lot of interest in his music, and then Dudamel and the LA Phil had brought out their complete Ives, and I had been captivated this for the months preceding that American music episode. And then here was Christopher absolutely loving this music too. And actually, in terms of recommendations, people, if you haven't heard that LA Phil Dudamel Ives box set, just listen to it. And if you can, listen to it all in one sitting. It's absolutely wonderful stuff. But I was thinking of the guests that I loved the most, and a lot of it was very personal stuff, people I had admired growing up. And funnily, Catherine Bott for me was, well, not funnily, obviously, Catherine Bott for me was a huge one. Now, one of my favourite CDs, and one of the first classical CDs that I just started listening to on loop, really, for sheer enjoyment, was one that she recorded with BBC Music Magazine of Renaissance love songs. This was my soundtrack over university. And then she was the first interview I produced, one of the first interviews I produced when I was working on Woman's Hour. And so to be sat discussing Emma Kirkby with Catherine Bott was one of those moments where I thought, okay, my career, I'm enjoying myself at this point in time.
She's also one of those, isn't she, that she's not precious at all.
No.
She can talk beautifully about the music and with great passion and knowledge, of course, but she does it in such an approachable way.
Oh, completely. And you can just laugh with her. I think she's absolutely wonderful. And Simon Callow as well, somebody I suppose I was a little bit shy of. I had passed by him in BBC studios and things, but never had a proper conversation. So I was a little bit nervous, actually, because I admired him so much and I wasn't sure how it was going to be. And then I ended up just falling in love, and just all of that knowledge, and so lightly worn, and he's such a gentleman, and that was one of my favourite episodes as well.
I'm glad you mentioned Chris Russell, the American conductor, at the beginning there, because I think more than any other person, he has introduced me to the most music that I've not come across before. He has this extraordinary thirst for those corners of the repertoire that remain relatively untouched, even if they're pieces that were written quite some time ago. And he often does like binge listening. He will pick on a composer and listen to everything that they've done, or all their symphonies, or something like that. And if you follow him on social media, he continually is introducing us to this music and what he thinks about it and why he's approached it and everything. Absolutely fascinating. I've discovered so much music, a lot of music that really does resonate with me that I never knew existed. He's introduced it to us, and again I think that's one of the great pleasures of this program is discovering, as Richard said as well, discovering this music that you didn't even know existed, and someone somewhere is really passionate about it. I have to say, one of the most pleasurable ones I think, certainly more recently, was actually the last one we did with the harpsichord player Mahan Esfahani, talking about myths about classical music. Now he likes to be a disruptor a little bit and he's a great thinker, he's a great reader, he really knows his stuff, and of course, a highly regarded harpsichordist who has a endless amount of very fine reviews behind him of his recordings and things. But it was just so interesting to hear him talk about something away from the actual music in a sense, and much more about the myths around it, and particularly about performance practice and approaches to music. I thought that was really interesting. And actually, all connected to that, Michael Seal, the conductor, who came on to talk about the most shocking moments in music, and he talked about certain things that have happened within the industry. I mean, most particularly, kind of almost sweeping under the carpet the actions of certain conductors that have been found out that have been rather unsavoury. Something that the industry really does need to actually get a bit of a grip of and look at itself more closely on. And I was pleased to hear Mike talk about that too, because that, again, slightly away from the music. But then someone like Thomas Allen, the singer, who comes on and talks about his favourite male voices, I just thought he revealed so much about other singers that one wouldn't necessarily think about when you're not a singer yourself and you're only really listening as they when they're performing. I thought that, again, fascinating to hear someone like that, who's that extraordinary experience and success, talking about other singers. Because I often wonder when I've asked these people to do the programme, sometimes what you want to do is you want to find people who don't have much of an ego, or alternatively are at a certain end of their career. That means that they don't mind talking about other performers within their profession. Because you can imagine, can't you, if you're an up-and-coming singer and everything, and you really feel that you're the one, you're the next thing, it's hard to actually go around talking about other singers, because you want to concentrate on what you're doing, and you don't really want to admit that there are lots of other people who are also interesting to listen to. So it's been there's a balancing act that's been going on behind the scenes here to get the right people in to do this show. I thought Tom Allen grabbed the opportunity absolutely brilliantly, and as did many of them. But I'm reminded of, whenever I interviewed John Williams, the film composer, the worst question you could ever ask him was, who are the other composers working today that you admire? He just thinks, oh my God, what am I going to say? Because everyone is listening to everything he says, because he's absolutely, the unquestionable governor of film music right now. And he doesn't want to miss anyone out. He wants to be really nice about everyone. And he thinks if he picks 3 people, there are going to be 40 people who will go, oh my God, John Williams hates me. It's all of that. And that happens a lot, I think, in the choices within this programme. With the guests that we've had, some of them will be really worried, particularly those with a profile, that they walk away from recording the podcast and immediately there's going to be loads of people thinking, oh, he didn't pick me. Why didn't he pick me? Is there something wrong with me? What have I done wrong? Did he go to one of my performances? Oh no, all that. So it's been quite fun to try and tease people into these choices.
When I started at the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra many years ago as a sort of office junior, my sort of then boss and long-term colleague Sandra Roberts said to me, if anyone asks you, if you're dealing with an artist and any of them ever ask you your opinion on another artist, anything at all, the answer is nice person, lovely player, great guy, lovely player. That's what you say. Nothing more than that. And this, I think, professionally, if you're working in this industry, that is the golden rule, isn't it? If things get around, things get about, people are sensitive. Even a judicious judgment. I mean, any critic knows this. Any critic knows that you can write 800 words of rave, and you'll then, within 24 hours, you'll be at the centre of a furious Twitter storm because you wrote 5 words of qualification somewhere in that. They hone in unerringly on the slightest hint of negativity. People are sensitive. Performers are, aren't they? They're putting it out there. They're people who are laying their emotions, their personalities on the line, who depend on their professional skill. And it's in the business, you have to sort of maintain this bland, affable, encouraging persona, which is no bad thing in many ways. So as you said, it does lead to things getting covered up, to sort of lies being tolerated, to sort of untruths being widely accepted. Sometimes not always as positively as I've framed it, but the impulse is shrewd, I think, to sort of
I
be
suspect
Yeah,
it's not just performers either. I mean, I think there's a certain extent to which the readership quite likes a little bit of controversy and will latch onto the negative things that you write. I mean, I remember I found myself handled into a Twitter conversation which appeared to be about some quote I had made about some pianist not quite hitting it for me in a particular piece years ago. And these two guys in, I think, China were still arguing about whether I was right or not. And yeah, they were clearly having a great time over it too. And I just sat there thinking, I really wish I didn't know that.
I found something like that the other day. Yes, it's something about 4 or 5 years ago. An editor said, "Could you write me just like 300 words, sort of making the case against Bach, just to wind people up?" And I did. I just wrote this sort of slight sarky, flippant little piece, just saying these are all the reasons why perhaps there are alternatives to Johann Sebastian Bach. He's not necessarily the god of music. It was just totally playful and. I found something the other day. Someone's done an entire blog post. Is Richard Bradley's assessment of Bach correct? And saying it's clear sensationalism. He's obviously desperate to get published by saying something shocking. I say, well, no, I was writing what the editor asked me to write.
We talked about this.
That's sort of how
we talked about this a little bit with
know.
with Mahan Esfahani, didn't we? In the last edition about. I think it was one of mine that I hate it that everyone just says everything is wonderful all the time, particularly in broadcasting, when quite clearly it isn't. And actually, you kind of brought me onto something I wanted to bring up, because I wanted to talk about the slightly bigger subjects that have come up in the last year and a half or so with lockdown and everything as well. And one of them that I've spoken about a little bit before in the podcast is this extraordinary survey that came out just before lockdown, actually the first lockdown, by Arts Professional, called Freedom of Expression Survey. And this was a survey of many hundreds of people who are working in arts organisations about how they find their ability to freely express themselves in their views on any number of things, whether it be politics or music or anything really. And what it found, and I quote them here, is it shone a light upon coercion, bullying, intimidation, and intolerance among a community that thinks of itself as liberal, open-minded, and equitable. I found it an absolutely shocking survey of findings, because this is a group of people, and many people I've worked with organisations like this my whole career, and it was shocking to find how so many people feel so afraid of saying something that might be interpreted by their bosses or someone else within the industry as being unreasonable and not really following the orthodoxy. And in fact, the whole thing nicely summed up by one person who wrote in the survey, "I often feel pressure to self-censor for fear of being cancelled or bullied for not conforming to the orthodoxy." What an extraordinary thing to be saying about the arts in 2020 and 2021. Now, the reason I bring this up is because, of course, what happened was this survey came out just before lockdown, and then everybody had something else to seriously, obviously, to worry about. And it kind of got swept under the carpet, which is very, very convenient, of course. But I want to keep reminding people of this because I think it's something we need to talk about. The industry needs to talk about this. We can't have it that if someone, for example, supports Brexit, they should be allowed to say so without the rest of their organisation essentially sending them to commentary. It's outrageous that should happen, particularly in the arts when the general view of the arts is that it is, as they said, more liberal and open-minded. What do the both of you think?
Well, I think it's absolutely correct. I think that, another example is that you don't have to be a Jeremy Corbyn supporter to be work in the classical music world. It just helps if you don't say you're not at the appropriate time. I think that there is a big left bias as well, or at least it feels that way. And I guess as a critic, I never feel under pressure to write what I don't think to be nicer than I should be about something when it's a musical performance or a production. But there's some self-censoring that does go on, or at least just keeping quiet, if I'm in a political discussion or a Brexit discussion or whatever else it is, I'm one of these people who is a floating voter, sits on the side, and as a former news journalist, I hope that I'm questioning everybody, but I know that there are some questions that I simply cannot ask in certain groups of classical music colleagues, which is a huge shame, and I think that it's something that we need to be talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, Richard, when you post up a review of the Magic Flute or something, there's always someone, isn't there, that comes in and says, well, I'm not reading this, it's in the Spectator, this terrible far right wing rag of a thing, I'm not going to read it. As if somehow
Yes.
your review of the Magic Flute is sort of an infiltration of their rights I don't even get it.
That's right. That's right. Every week at the Spectator, I phoned up and we're told what Dominic Cummings has instructed us to sort of encode into our reviews of, Rossini's
Yes.
La Cenerentola or whatever. That's exactly how it works. Yes, a grand sinister conspiracy. The fact I'm telling you this is itself an elaborate form of love. But this goes on. I know a bloke who writes an entire blog about this stuff. It's hilarious that it wasn't so weird. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's a sort of groupthink happens in all sorts of circumstances. I mean, it was a sort of, I think there's a certain frame of mind, a certain fundamentally okay, normal, decent, well-adjusted, well-meaning frame of mind that kind of assumes that its perspective on the world, its way of looking at the world, is not a political view. It's just a reasonable view that all decent, sensible, nice, right-thinking people think. And I'm pretty sure that's what's going through the head of the chief executive of Radio British Orchestra, who emailed his staff telling them how to vote in 2016 on Brexit. He actually sent an email to them all round saying, for the benefit of this organisation, you should really be voting this way. Obviously, I'm not telling you how to vote. I am the CEO. I'm not telling you how to vote. It would be better for this organisation if you voted this way. And I'm sure that person thought they were not doing anything remotely other than completely reasonable, completely fair, completely objective, nothing political about telling people to vote one way. Apparently, if it's the right way. It's so funny. I say, we do get this all the time. I mean, one of the things you see all the time, the louder, angrier, more confident voices are the loudest, as you'll find out in any musicians' union meeting. And the other people just keep quiet. They want a quiet life. I mean, that recurring theme you see over and again. For no musicians who love Brexit, the entire profession is against it. It's a disgrace. It's trash. Everything. It's awful. And then, and you think, I don't know a single musician who supports Brexit. And I think, yeah, interesting what they've been telling you, isn't it? It's interesting, curious who you've been talking to in that case, because that's not what. Perhaps you should be thinking out. Why you don't know any musicians who apparently don't support Brexit, why they're not telling you they do this. It's interesting. I mean, what was the... I mean, again, the other thing is, I'm the classic was again, I will have to... This is being fairly anonymous. Again, the chief executive of the major orchestra who... I think of that morning being talking on the radio or something, or to the press about the catastrophic effect of how touring regulations are going to devastate our industry, and this has completely, wiped the landscape clear. We're going to take us years to recover. And then I think it's like within the same day, I had an email from the director of marketing at that same organisation saying, we want you to help us prepare a press release about all our tours coming up this month. Make sure you mention we're going to Salzburg. Make sure you mention we're going to Lucerne. Make sure you mention that we're going to 6 different continental destinations. It's our biggest touring year ever. So obviously, this that was for one set of sponsors. The line that was given to the I think to whichever newspaper it was they're talking to is a very different one, the public line. And I've had that many chief executives, coming up to me and saying, well, yeah, we all know this. We can't say it because people will get upset and, we don't want to upset.
Oh, the number of times I get private messages from people in the industry saying, I can't say this on Facebook, but, and then off they go. I think that's such a shame. I've been trying so hard to try not to do that. As much as I can. Of course, we all got careers and we all want to protect our careers and we all want to work in this industry that we love. But it can be quite difficult. I mean, I got accused here. I put a post up about my partner who works for one of the big orchestras and about how proud we were of her because under extraordinary circumstances and with the twins and everything. And I said that, no one ever thinks about the admin staff. The emphasis is always on the players. And I was accused by an orchestral player of having a very low regard for all, and that was capitalised, all orchestral players. Now, it's not remotely true, and I've spent my entire career creating work for them. It's crazy to think that, but I suppose if I'm being generous, I can think that, it's been such a hard time for everyone in this last year or so. Everybody's a bit on edge. Everybody's actually worried, even though they've now announced that things are going to be relaxed. I don't think anyone is completely convinced that this is going to be the end of it, particularly not promoters and venues. It's an incredibly nervy time. But it does show how even the tiniest little thing that seems totally innocuous can be blown up and made to be something that perhaps it isn't, because people are just so on edge, they're so worried about everything all the time.
I think also there's an issue that in society now, I think partly because of social media, we have become a society that does cancel people very quickly, that has removed the grey areas. It's all black and white. Politics is about good and bad, moral and immoral, rather than something a little bit more nuanced. And I think that the danger for the arts world is that I think traditionally, centuries ago, the arts world, artists, composers have sometimes reflected society, they've sometimes challenged it, but they've been free to do that. And I think that us going down the same censorship route, black and white route that the rest of society is doing now is a bad thing.
Okay, let's move on to something much more positive, which is that you've both been going to concerts. You've been going to operas again, which is fantastic. I've only been to one concert, apart from a couple of things I did for the Wigmore Hall last year. I went to a concert in Snape when I was on holiday a few weeks ago. And it was the Aurora Orchestra, Nick Collin conducting, Alan Clayton, brilliant Alan Clayton, singing the Serenade for Tenor Horn and Strings by Britten at Snape, of course. That in itself is special. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a fabulous night, brilliantly programmed. It only lasted about an hour and 15 minutes, which seemed perfectly good to me. It was, however, an odd experience. There's no getting around the fact, sitting there miles away from anybody else in the audience and also wearing a mask. It's not what you really want at all. How have you both found this whole experience? I mean, just given in context, all those months where you couldn't go to anything at all, and then suddenly the doors open, albeit slightly, and you're able to go in. Charlotte, how have you actually really found it? I mean, not the performances themselves, but the actual act of going.
The actual act of going, it was a funny one for me. I only made it to 2 concerts before the Delta variant reared its head, and I decided that I was actually too scared to go on the tube until I'd had my second jab. So I managed, and now I'm off to the Verbier Festival for this weekend, and I cannot wait to get some more live music again with the 2 jabs in my arm. But when I went to the 2 concerts that I went to, which were both at the Barbican, it was strange being sat far away from everybody. I would have been just as happy actually with more people in the room. I'm not somebody who thinks that I want social distancing to continue in order to feel safe. I would be perfectly confident just to go in with a mask. I do think moving forwards, I mean, in terms of yes, it was just a strange experience being so physically separated from everybody else. I did rather like the idea that, a bit like in an everyman cinema, you can order your drinks to be on your seat when you arrive. I thought that was quite nifty. I could do that again.
Maybe that'll stay.
Well, yes. And also, I mean, I have to say, I like the format, as I have liked at festivals I've been to before COVID, the idea that you don't have an interval, but you have a slightly longer concert. And I think that, I mean, certainly if you look at the Verbier Festival this weekend, they're doing something really interesting with that programming. So it's 2 like an hour and a half concerts, and there is overlap between those concerts, but they're also thinking about how they can persuade people to come for the second one if they want. So they keep the symphony the same both times, but they switch the concerto and the soloist. So it's actually a treat hearing that symphony a second time. It's a gift for the orchestra to actually be able to perform a symphony twice rather than just once. And you get a different concerto. And I really like that way of doing things. In terms of me going forwards now, I have to say, what I would be hoping for is that I have no problem with going back to 100% capacity. I think we've got to. COVID's here to stay. I do think masks would be a good idea. And I do also think that people should, as they have been with Wimbledon, presenting some kind of COVID something in order to get in, whether that's a double jabbed thing on your NHS app. But I think that for me to feel really safe, that's what I would want. But I will go anyway because I'm so desperate to go to concerts.
Richard, just before I bring in a couple of comments that were on Facebook on this subject, because I asked people, as I always do, for their contributions about this. Seems to me that the the bottom line is that the government thinks that 80,000 people hugging and kissing each other in Wembley is okay, but Glyndebourne audiences, whoa, steady on, they must be apart and they must wear a mask because that's really bad. I mean, ultimately it's more complicated than that, but my goodness, it feels that it's simple, and the entire industry is justifiably feeling victimised by the way in which this government is doing it.
Well, feeling victimised is kind of what.
No, it is, but we'd
be doing that.
I know.
We would find a way to feel the victims of the situation. It's not great. I mean, I went been to 3 football matches my entire life, all of them under duress. I hated the experience in each case. I felt intimidated.
This is not about football, though, Richard. This is about an attitude towards sport compared to arts,
but one factor I did kind of notice was that they don't tend to have roofs, these buildings, do they?
No.
They do tend to be outdoors, which is kind of different from when you're crammed into an opera house.
Only makes a difference if you are also socially distanced outdoors. If you're all hugging and kissing and next to each other the entire time, it's an airborne disease, and that's how it spreads. And of course, there have already been a huge number of reports of people being tested positive after that event. I don't want to concentrate on that. I don't want to concentrate on that too much. But let me say something. I wanted to bring David Kent in here, who is an amateur singer in one of the big. I think the BBC Symphony Chorus. Just it brings in another aspect to all this. So I'd be interested to know what you think on Facebook. He says he points out about non-professional choristers. Life pre-COVID could already be quite uncomfortable, particularly on stages like the Barbican, where as choristers you're really crammed in, and because of that, he feels pretty uncomfortable as a singer being shoehorned in there on the stage. And he said he won't be doing those gigs in future in any case. He says, until COVID is definitely in the past, I will be sceptical about large-scale choral activities. The double jab is evidently no guarantee of immunity from the Delta variant, and there's the threat of long COVID if it all goes wrong. I mean, he along with many people, is still quite nervous about this whole thing, even if it's proved that, choirs present no more problem than anybody else, any other group of people. People are still going to be nervous about this. This is performers as much as anybody else.
Well, it'll be an individual choice, won't it? And when will COVID be decisively behind us? I suppose when flu and common cold are decisively behind us. I do think there's something that I think there's the earlier points we're talking about. I think it's about what's politically acceptable as much as anything, isn't it? I mean, and I do think what seems very, very likely is that from the foreseeable future, now we've established a sort of principle of lockdowns, of public social distancing, of all these various measures. Do you remember, for the last 20 years, there have been various scares of pandemics that never really kind of happened. Bird flu, SARS, swine flu, various things. You hear of them happening at the opposite side of the world. The brief panic alarm. I think it was a period when we all put out hand gel. I remember in concert halls in about 2009, and it sort of never went anywhere. And I assume there'll be other ones in future which will probably just appear and sputter. But of course, the instant now that this happens, people are going to get upset. People are going to get anxious, understandably and justifiably. They'll call for action. Politicians will be, queuing up in the House of Commons, asking, tell each other to take swift and decisive action. And what swift and decisive action sends a signal, shows you've done something quickly, easily done, with minimum protests. Let's shut down all the performance venues. There's going to be a lot more of that happening at short notice. I think for the next decade, we'll be getting this every couple of years, whether or not there's a health crisis.
You may be right, and of course,
and it's just
I'm getting the distinct feeling, and in fact, I've heard people say in the industry that if there's another lockdown at all this year, they will just jack it in. Their business can't sustain it any longer, and they just won't be able to carry on. They'll have to find something else to do. I think there are going to be some orchestras at certain levels that's going to happen to, and also perhaps some smaller venues as well. I mean, the bigger ones will always get support, presumably from government.
It seems likely, doesn't it? I mean, it seems, knowing what we know of the economics of the sector, it's, you know, the fact is there is no money in classical music, and it's propped up at the best of times by an elaborate structure of subsidy and constant frantic fundraising. And sooner or later, the reserves are going to start running out, and the tough decisions will have to be taken, won't they? I suppose that is
here's something interesting that I read only this morning from Arts Professional again. 1 million adults took up an instrument during lockdown. How about that? They took up an
this
instrument.
was one of the few silver linings, I think, to the past crisis. The fact that people took up instruments, but also that chamber music was brought back to its original setting in the home. I mean, right back at the beginning, yes, the sound quality wasn't very great, but actually one of the joys of that first lockdown was hearing major artists without any help of wonderful acoustics or recording facilities, just performing their pianos, cellos in their living rooms. And there was something about it that was so back to basics, going back to the roots. I absolutely loved it. And finally, I've started playing more myself now. The Chopin's back on the piano, and
But you were at least a musician in the first place. I wonder who all these people are. This million people who took up an instrument. The suggestion is that these are people who haven't played an instrument before and have decided, given this time available, because they're not going to work. I mean, this was during lockdown, right? So it might probably not so much in the last few months or so, but they had this time available, and perhaps it's something they'd always meant to do. Because I think it's also very significant that it's adults that are taking this up. Something they always meant to do and they never quite got round to, and then suddenly there was this opportunity to take up an instrument. I think it's fantastic. 1 million people. That's a lot of people picking up. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how many people sustain it. But I love the idea of people. I know someone actually who wants to learn the trumpet. They're not musical at all. They just fancy learning the trumpet, and they've got the YouTube videos lined up because that's of course what you can do now. All they need is the instrument. I guess what a lot of these people will find is that if they want to turn to their county music service to line up a teacher, they'll find that it was decimated about 5 years ago, and there's no longer any support for that kind of thing. Let's hope that's not the case for most of them, but I think it's fantastic. That's one of the things that people turned to in lockdown, and in fact it brings me perfectly to our most popular podcasts that we've done as far as downloads is concerned, because that's really the only way we can tell how popular they are. The most downloaded podcast of all was the Piano Concertos edition with Stephen Hart. That really ticked a lot of boxes for people. And number 2 was actually the first ever episode, which was Music for Lockdown, when Stephen Maddock, the chief executive of the CBSO, joined us, and we all lobbed in our suggestions for music that we would turn to in lockdown, because we were all feeling pretty low about the whole thing about that point. But also what music would allow us to reflect, and also what would pick us up, of course, what music would pick us up. So that's quite interesting that one, I mean, okay, so it was the first episode, so it's had a longer chance to have more downloads, if you can put it that way. But I think that was quite interesting. And the third most popular one was Ways Classical Music Should Do Things Differently Post-Lockdown. That was another quite early one where we discussed that. Now, what's interesting about that one, I think, it'd be interesting to listen to it again, because, of course, there we were at the beginning of all of this, talking about post-lockdown. And now here we are, I mean, essentially less than a week away from all of the restrictions being lifted. A position I don't think we ever really saw. Well, I don't think any of us would have imagined it would take this long, did we, at that point? We thought maybe it would take a few months and then we'll be okay again. And it's gone on and on and on and on like that. But I thought that was interesting. And I wonder how many of the things that were suggested at the time, that classical music should do things differently, might be undertaken, because actually that's what most organisations have been discussing for the last year, isn't it? How do we actually react now that things are going to go back, that we're going to have full audiences again? How do we actually do it? Now, what do you two think about it? You said, Charlotte, that you can't wait for audiences to be full again. But should they have masks or not, do you think?
Joe, I was thinking about this last night. So what do you do if you've got a full concert hall and everyone's wearing masks, but there is an interval again and you want to drink at an interval? And so you all go into the bar and you take your masks off. So
defeats
are
the
you
object.
wearing masks or are you not wearing masks? You can't have it both. So it's a really tricky one.
But that's what we have in restaurants now, right? Everyone walks into the restaurant
Yes.
with a mask, but as soon as you sit down, you take them
Well,
off.
it's what we have
Yeah.
in opera
It's
houses
ticking the
as
box,
well.
isn't
I
it?
mean, it's
Yeah. But
no. I mean, sorry. I was just going to say. I mean, it's what we have. I was at Opera Holland Park in London last night, which is a sort of semi-outdoor venue. Their rule was you come up the steps, which all in the open air. You put the mask on, so you're technically in some area that's licensed as a theatre. You can then keep the mask on until you get to the seat. Then you can take the mask off. Then you have to put it on to go to the Louvre. And you can take it off when you go to the bar. And it was just anything they like. I think I'm not having a go at Opera Holland Park. It's a great show. They're doing their best to interpret the rules as they understand it. But I think this is the same everywhere. I mean, I've been. There's a country house opera I was at a couple of weeks ago where I think a good third of the audience weren't bothering with masks at all, but they did have people stationed at the door telling you to wash your hands on the way in with gel, which I kind of thought was not regarded as such I mean, it's not a bad thing, but
It's
kind
not
of
as
weird
impactful
how
as we
the rules
thought it
being
was at the
interpreted.
beginning, certainly.
Yeah, there are places where they zoom in and tell you. There's one I went to where the steward's being incredibly rigorous about the mask wearing, coming up to anyone not wearing a mask, reminding them to put one on. And then they said, they asked everyone to leave in an orderly fashion one at a time. And absolutely everyone ignored it, just got off and just formed a huge crowd and just pushed through the doors. So it's I mean, how much of this is for show? How much of this is a gesture? It's about confidence rather than any actual health. I mean,
well,
I don't know
at
about the
Snape,
health implications to say, but
at
it's sort
Snape,
of,
my mum, who I went with, would normally have a cushion for the seats because she doesn't find them particularly comfortable, and she absolutely typically forgot her cushion, but you weren't able to hire a cushion as you might normally do there, and this was because of COVID. And I couldn't really, to be honest, understand why it was because of COVID. I mean, you could easily clean the cushions like you clean the seats and then hire them out to the one person's going to use it for the rest of the evening, and then they hand it back or put it in a bin or something like that. I mean, when I can go to the gym and I can get a towel and I can use a towel and I put it in a bin and I leave. All these things work perfectly fine. So I think we've got quite a long way to go before we make things kind of feel like they make sense. But
I'm not even sure it's possible for it to feel as though it makes sense, to be honest.
Well, maybe not. But at least we've got
Everyone's
concerts to
just-
go to.
I think
that
yeah.
the thing that we're left with here is at least we've got stuff to go to. And one of the things that's quite interesting about some of the surveys that have been done is, I think it's similar one that came out of the fact that 1 million adults have taken up an instrument. Is also the vast majority of people are desperate to get back to seeing live music again, and that's all music really, not just classical music, but pop concerts as well and all that kind of stuff. People are really desperate to do it and are very keen to start buying tickets again. And actually, people are already buying tickets for things that are next year and beyond, particularly that in the pop industry when you can put a concert on for in 18 months' time and it'll sell out in a day. They are selling out, and that's really, really, really good news. I wanted to bring up something that's always been a joy for me in this podcast, and that is our little specialisms or our little passions. Anybody who's listened to this podcast a lot will know, for example, that Charlotte is very passionate about Baroque music, that I like 20th century and beyond music, and Richard is so often brought in stuff not just about Wagner, of course, but also about the more unusual corners of the British music repertoire as well. I just wonder whether either of you two, because I know I certainly have discovered music out of the things that we've talked about that perhaps you weren't expecting from each of our little areas of interest. Charlotte?
Well, I mean, you brought me to Arnold Symphony No. 5.
Oh, yes, of course.
So that was one for me. And then in terms of the listener suggestions, Nigel Simeon put me on to Vaughan Williams' second London Symphony. Those were my two big discoveries, I have to say, and they were wonderful ones.
Richard?
I've got to say, Charlotte's enthusiasm for Martineau's violin concertos came as a surprise to me. There's a discovery, and that's pieces I've actually been listening to quite a lot over the last few weeks for various reasons. Your own. I mean, I there's that film called Mr. Holland's Opus, which I always thought was the most abominable piece of schmaltz.
Well, it is.
And hearing you talk so enthusiastically about just unwatchable almost. I think of Richard Gere, I think of one thing, and it involves rodents. It doesn't involve
Well,
music.
but I mean,
But,
particularly since Richard Gere isn't in Mr. Holland's opus. Richard Dreyfuss.
oh really?
Richard
Oh sorry. Well,
Dreyfuss
this is how much I know about these things. But yes, I'm still trying to seek out that piece, a good recording of that piece at the end of the end of the film that you talk so
I'll send it to
enthusiastically
you.
about. I genuinely
Tell you one of the other things
it's
that
that
I've
reminder, isn't
absolutely
it?
loved about these podcasts is how, I mean, particularly Richard and I are sort of a tried and tested formula for Gramophone Classics Reconsidered. So we kind of knew before this podcast that we saw eye to eye on things, but just the number of times over the podcast where the two of us have come up with a suggestion, one of us has come up with a suggestion and the other has just collapsed in laughter or fist pumped the air because they just cannot believe that the other picked that random corner of the repertoire and the other person's picked that too. I mean, I was thinking at the time that in the solo instruments, we both picked Sciarrino Capriccio No. 2. I mean, how the hell did that happen?
Yeah, it's obvious, really,
And,
isn't it?
you know, Glazunov 4 in Russian symphonies. We both picked Telemann's solo violin sonatas. It's been so much fun just to discover that we also have the same really random niche tastes.
Yeah, I like that.
I've got. I mean, we had James McMillan on as well. I mean, that time I thought I'd thought everything there was to think about Tristan and Isolde. I know they've renowned for that score inside out, and he said something about it which made me absolutely go back to it with completely new ears. He absolutely transformed my perspective on that piece, and it's still something I'm going to keep interrogating.
Well, actually, that was.
He was
That's what I was going to
astonishing,
say about you two. It wasn't just about introducing me to new music that I hadn't heard before. It's more really about coming to pieces that I'd already knew, but with new ears. And that certainly has happened to me with Wagner, Richard, with the way that you've talked about Wagner, and I've gone away and listened to it with different ears, which is it's so important. I'm still not a massive fan of the singing bit, but I do love the music. And also, Charlotte, with Baroque music, because it is such a gap in my knowledge. And I think I really do put that down to performance in a way. I spent so many years of my life performing music. And of course, as a percussionist, you tend not to play Baroque music apart from on the timbs. So you don't get, I wasn't absorbing it in the same way that I was with orchestral music, more modern orchestral music. And all the rest
I think there's also, with Baroque, there's also the question of performance. You may not have heard great performances before. I read something really interesting yesterday that young French rising Baroque violinist Théotime Langlois de Swart, he's just released an album with William Christie, and he was saying that one of the things about the Baroque world is that whereas with a Brahms sonata, a Brahms violin sonata, it's kind of all there on the page and you can give a fairly normal, average performance of it, and it still speaks to you because of the way the notes are. Whereas with Baroque music, you have to put so much extra of yourself into it, so much emotion, or it just falls flat. And that resonated with me. I think.
Well, and the performance practice, the period performance stuff, and particularly people like Reinhard Goebel, had really got me going with a lot of recordings of Baroque music. Got me back into it again, got me excited about it again, because some of those recordings really are quite extraordinary and exciting and sort of violent and fun. I really enjoyed that. But on the other hand, then I hear, I mean, it's not Baroque music, but then I hear, as I did on his 90th birthday concert, Neville Marriner performing Mozart. And all you hear is the music. You don't hear the performance practice. You don't hear the techniques. You just hear the music. There's space for everything, but it was a big moment for me hearing that performance. I was thinking, actually, I'm not thinking about whether they're doing vibrato or anything like that. What I'm listening to here is music. I thought that was the brilliant thing about Neville Marriner, and actually it was so refreshing because our ears have now been attuned to period performance, and it can so often seem very weirdly old-fashioned to hear just an orchestra play a piece of Baroque music or indeed classical period music in a straight way like that. But it was so affecting. I couldn't believe it, that suddenly I was liking a Mozart piano concerto, for God's sake. It was so beautifully done, so beautifully rendered, and it wasn't an authentic performance. I love that. I'll never forget that. Now, I asked you guys to come up with some event or recording or something to do with classical music that we can send our listeners away with on a high note here. Some recommendations for people to go away and experience something. What have you come up with, Richard?
Well, thinking of things after the last 12 months, really, things I've discovered during this period. There's a DVD of an operetta by Jaromir Weinberger, if you've heard of him. He wrote a piece called Schwander the Bagpiper in the 1920s in Czech composer, which was moderately well known. And my youth orchestra used to play the polka for Schwander the Bagpiper. That's all I knew about it. Anyway, Barry Kosky, the director, in Berlin, has been discovering all these sort of operettas of the interwar era. It's a period, it's a style I'm really interested in. I really love operetta. It's something I really get into. He discovered this operetta by Jaromir Weinberger called Spring Storms. He claimed it was the last ever Weimar Republic operetta. It was shut down by Hitler just after it started its run. It was all the signs were it would be a smash. He'd reconstructed it. It's on this DVD performance of his production in Berlin, and it's a stunner. It's just a ravishingly beautiful score. It's funny, it's frothy, it's got high-kicking chorus girls, it's also got espionage, it's got tragedy, it's got the Russo-Chinese War of 1905. It's a haunting sadness and this unbelievably frothy silliness, and the two come together. He does it with incredible panache and style. It's a beautiful looking production available on DVD. I really liked that very much. It's something I think that really sort of warmed me during the early months of lockdown.
Remind us the name
recently,
of it again and the composer.
Oh, I haven't said it's called Frühlingsstürme, Spring Storms by Jaromir Weinberger. And yeah, it's an operetta which, at one point a man urinates off the stage while humming Lenski's aria from Eugene Onegin, and at another point you have the most rapturously bittersweet sort of waltz duets, yearning sadness, sort of feeling the world coming to an end in this most luscious music. And I did not know it. No one knew it. The thing hadn't been heard for best part of 90 years, and there it is. We can hear it.
People weeing in inappropriate places sounds perfect for my twins. I'll take them to it immediately.
But also, I mean, just a recording that came out. I saw the UK premiere of this opera, the first professional performance ever of this opera, on Friday night in Buxton at the Buxton Met Hall. It's one of the most exciting things that's happening this new season. It's Malcolm Arnold's opera, The Dancing Master. It's recorded at the end of last year by a terrific cast conducted by John Andrews, and it is a zinger of a piece. It is everything. Malcolm Arnold's comic opera. We never thought of Malcolm Arnold as an opera composer. We've come back to him over and over again as a symphonist, as a composer of light music and film music. He's been one of the recurring themes of this podcast, I think, just how enthusiastic we all feel about his music. This is completely fresh, major new work by Malcolm Arnold, effectively rediscovered from nowhere, and it's a corker. It's hilarious. Imagine a sort of 17th century comic farce. The kind of zip and pizzazz of something like Gianni Schicchi or I don't know, Il Segreto di Susanna, one of these things, one of these great comic one actors, but with a kind of musical language that sounds a bit like it could be a Carry On film, and it's all that Arnold zest, wit, sarcasm, low humour, melody, and they perform it like a dream. And that is just sort of 70 minutes of solid sunshine, tonic, life affirming, effervescent. It's like having an Aperol spritz in musical form. It's just
okay. Well,
puts you in a happy.
You've queued me up for the most predictable thing I shall say in this podcast, which is one of the things that I want to recommend to everyone, is the prom, because we got the proms back, of course. I mean, not in its fullest form, predictably, but it is looking like a really good, strong season of interesting programs, much shorter than normal, of course, no interval and things like that. But my goodness, it must have taken a Herculean effort to get this stuff together under these circumstances. So it's great to see the proms back in at least some kind of form that was more confident than last year. This is on the 27th of August. It's the BBC Symphony Orchestra conducted by Zachary Oromo. A piece by Charlotte Bray, a relatively new piece. Walton's Viola Concerto. A piece by John Folds, who's a composer that Zachary Oromo has championed before, particularly with the CBSO when he was there. Le Cabaret Overture, and finishing with Malcolm Arnold's Fifth Symphony, the piece I've banged on about more than any other in this podcast. It is unbelievably the first time it had been performed at the proms, which, considering this is a piece that's nearly 60 years old, is amazing. But thank goodness it's there. I've talked about it before. About how pleased I am that it's there and how we are taking full credit for its inclusion in the proms, even though Zachary Oromo says that they thought about it before. I don't believe a word of it. But there it is, Pride of Place in a concert. I can't wait to hear it. And I really, if you still haven't come to it, I don't want to build it up so much that you'll just inevitably be disappointed. But I think it'll be a great occasion. It's just great for those of us that have really tried to support Malcolm Arnold's music for so long, to see that piece so prominent within the season is terrific. Great program, actually, I have to say. Charlotte Bray's music always fascinates me, and Walton Viola Concerto, fantastic. So that's a great concert to be. So that's the 27th of August, Prom. I don't know whether it's being televised or not, but obviously it will be live on Radio 3. Charlotte, something from you.
Okay, I've got two things. The first is a book that I reviewed for Gramophone last year, Counterpoint by Philip Kennicott. Now, this is a wonderful book. He's a gramophone writer as well, actually. Basically, as his mother lay dying of cancer, he was packing to go and stay with her and be with her at the end. And he just chucked on a complete whim just a CD of Bach's solo violin partitas and sonatas. And over the weeks that followed, it turned out that the chaconne, the famous D minor chaconne, was the only thing he could actually listen to. He just listened to it over and over and over again. And he writes beautifully about this. And then he got home and he needed something else, but he also needed to stick with Bach. And so he decided that he was going to learn the Goldberg variations by himself from scratch. He was a sort of a lapsed pianist, and the book is about doing that. It's a memoir of him as a pianist, talking through his the story of him and his piano teachers, sometimes good relationships, sometimes not, troubled relationship with a mother who was kind of semi-abusive, the beautiful way he writes about Bach, the knowledge and the love. It's kind of its analysis, its history, its performer thoughts. It's absolutely beautiful. And I know it sounds like a fairly miserable book. I mean, deaf, semi-abusive mother, all the rest of it. But it's actually not. It's strangely uplifting, and it's one that still walks. It's still in my head now, and occasionally an image will pop into my mind. So I can't recommend that one highly enough. As
So
much as anything
name an
else,
author again.
Philip Kennicott. And it's called Counterpoint. And I wish I could write like Bach the way he does, because it's just absolutely beautiful. And then the other is an album that's newly out that has massively impressed me. It's Kit Armstrong, young American pianist. And going back to talk of performance practice, this is an album, a double album of William Byrd and John Bull. It's called Visionaries of Piano Music. And it's played on a modern concert ground. And I looked at this and did a double take, because, of course, pianists are reclaiming Bach for the proper piano. That's a thing that's happening. But Old English virginal music was something a little bit different. And he's done it absolutely wonderfully. I mean, the bank of scholarly study that has gone into this, and he's written his own very extensive, very lovingly written sleeve notes, and the virtuosity from him at the same time. It's been very interesting, the performance decisions that he's made with regard to tempo, and in terms of, for example, when you think of a period, if somebody's making a period performance on a piano, you'll generally find it's quite clipped and airy. What he's done is say, no, actually, when I'm looking at these original manuscripts, they have really painstakingly worked out exactly how long that beat should be. So I'm going to play it until the end of that beat. And so he's managed to create these wonderful airy textures, very light on pedal, but at the same time, it's smooth, it's full. And it's wonderful stuff. And it kind of plays with your hearing as well, because largely he's taken the Baroque, the Baroque harpsichord composers, basically, if they needed to create volume, they added more notes. And he's largely trusted in their technique of doing that. So when it suddenly gets louder, it is largely because he's playing more notes and not because he's putting more pressure on. Every now and then, but it's an interesting one listening to, because it plays with your perceptions. And sometimes I found myself thinking, hang on, what is happening here? Is he playing it louder, or is it just more notes? And it's fascinating. It's a fascinating listen. It's beautiful. I think it's a groundbreaking set of interpretations. First of all, in taking this repertoire and putting it on the modern piano, and then the performance decisions and how they've panned out. I think it's incredibly impressive. And this guy is still, I think, only in his mid-20s.
Couple of suggestions from people on Facebook. Judith Bingham, the composer, said that she really liked Bird's Song, which is a track from a new CD by Jocelyn Pook called Drawing Life, using words and drawings from children at the Terezin concentration camp. She said it caught my ear and is beautifully performed. And Tim Burton, who's a radio presenter and film music nut, and also regular listener to this show, he suggests a very big highlight of the past year is Dudamel's Mahler 2 film, and that mammoth Andre Previn Warner archive CD box set. Anyone who's seen a picture of it is certainly mammoth. There's a lot of absolutely cracking performances on that, that's for sure. So thanks to you two for your suggestions. My final one, by the way, is a book. Also, it happens to be by a friend of mine, but I think it's an important book, and I've been loving reading it because there's lots of great stories in there. And it's Humphrey Burton's autobiography. Humphrey Burton, one of the most important sort of figures in television arts, really, of the last 50 or so years. He essentially created the template for concert broadcasting and arts broadcasting, really much broader than just music, as the head of music and arts at the BBC, and also in commercial television as well. Just the sheer number of things that he was responsible for that we now remember so well. I mean, at the top of the list really has to be Young Musician of the Year, of course, which he created, and is still going, and has given great opportunities to a large number of phenomenal international musicians that we all now love listening to. Some of them have been guests on this show, in fact. It's just full of these great stories about how they made things like, for example, The Golden Ring, which was that key television documentary about the making of Scholti and Vienna Philharmonic's Ring Cycle, the first one to be committed to record. And particularly the recording of Götterdämmerung, that again almost unsurpassed as a window into the world of recording. And as Richard has often said, you're watching an orchestra discover this extraordinary music before its eyes. And you know, where do you stop with Humphrey? He's just done so many things. There isn't much about his sort of personal life, really. There is quite a colourful one, putting it that way. But it's really more about his professional life and the people they work with. And of course, central to that is Leonard Bernstein, because he was Bernstein's main producer for concert films for many, many years, and a personal friend. So it's a great one to dive into with all the stories and anecdotes and all that kind of stuff. All right, well, unless anyone else has got anything else they're desperate to recommend to our listeners, I
don't think I mentioned the name of the Malcolm Arnold opera. I was enthusing about it.
You did. You were so enthusiastic, you forgot to say what it was called. Yeah.
I know. I'm just thinking.
Fair enough. The
dancing. Hope you do
too. All right. Thank you very much, both of you. Well, that is it. We've come to the end of the Classical Top 5. Thank you so much to everyone who's listened to us in the last 15 months, the thousands of you that have downloaded our episodes and contributed with ideas. Reading your suggestions every week has been a genuine eye-opener for us all, I think. Full of discoveries, opening up unusual corners of the repertoire and celebrating the classics, of course. I know many of you have been with us from the very beginning. Thank you for your time and for your loyalty. It's much appreciated. And thank you to all the incredible guests who have willingly given up their morning to bang on about their favourite music, always with passion and deep knowledge. But most of all, thank you to my fellow cohorts in this enterprise, Richard and Charlotte, of course, but also Fiona Maddox, who was with us for the first few months, and our producer, Simon Funnell, who's edited the show every week to make us sound respectable. None of them had to do it, and we've all done it for nothing. We've loved it. When all else is collapsing around us, and there have certainly felt like moments like that in the past year, there's always music, and we'll never stop exploring. In the coming weeks on our social media channels, Facebook and Twitter, I'm going to be picking some of my favourite editions of the Classical Top 5 and linking to them again. So do look out for that. And please do continue to nominate your top 5s of any music subject you wish. I'll suggest a few myself, I think, on the Facebook and Twitter pages. We may not be recording podcasts, but there's no reason why we can't continue the fun in other ways. From Richard, Charlotte, Simon and me, Tommy Pearson, goodbye.